Boy, how fast time flies. It's been a week and I'm still in the same clothes, right? How wild. Hi everyone. This is my favorite lecture that I do every year, every semester. I do this for the 350 class as well, for 340, whatever it is, the other class I do. And I love this lecture because this has a tendency to like, because I mean, even as I research it, and as I learned it for the first time, and then began to research it, it really ties in. Kind of, this is the reality of what we're all dealing with. Okay, so there's so many things here that play a factor in why the treatment community is kind of the way that it is, that it's just like, wow. I hope that this lecture is impactful. I hope that this lecture is a big eye opener. And I hope this lecture makes you kind of like reflect and consider, consider a lot of this stuff, in a different way or in a different light. It is football season, not right now, because this is August the 28th. But when you watch this, I think the Bengals will have played New England this afternoon, if I have my dates right in my brain. So it's football season, which means I am happy, and I put all of my faith and hope into Joseph Burrow, in the hope that we can go to the Super Bowl. There will be a couple of weeks where I'm actually going to be traveling to Charlotte to go watch the Bengals play, and then also to New York for my birthday to watch them play the Giants on Sunday Night Football. So if you watch Sunday Night Football, you might see my face, because that's what you want to see. All right, so let's talk about the way in which we look at drugs. Here's going to be the big topic, or the big idea for you to consider and for you to carry with you. Okay. Racism, classism, and recently a little sprinkle of capitalism have led to the treatment environment being what it is today. Okay. Racism, classism, and a little sprinkle of capitalism. You put that all in a pot and you get what we're dealing with the way in which society looks at drugs, the way in which we as a society approach people who struggle with addiction. Okay. Now you may be wondering, Jordan, how does all of that make sense? And I will tell you, baby birds. So how do we look at drugs? Today we're going to talk about what is the history of how our views on drugs have been shaped by our culture. How does racism and class discrimination play a role in our drug laws? How do those drug laws shape our view of persons who struggle with addiction? And further, this might get a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. Okay. So let's start with the drug schedule classification pyramid. Okay. That's what you have here. Now there's some typos here, but it's fine. Basically what the law has done is we have scheduled, or the FDA has done, is that we have put drugs in a particular schedule or particular class, schedules 1 through 5. Okay. So schedule 1s are those that have no accepted medical use in the United States. Okay. Or a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision, meaning we have no constants, and a high potential for abuse. So these are things like heroin. These are things like LSD, which we're going to talk about that later on in the semester. Marijuana. What? Why is heroin and marijuana on the same level? You may be asking yourself. And a few other things, right? So then our level 2s, hydromorphone, oxycodone, fentanyl, which fentanyl is deadly, right? But it has a medical use. People use it for cancer treatment. We're going to talk about that when we get to the opiates, right? But it, like marijuana is listed as a higher scheduled drug than fentanyl, at least not now. Now it's being proposed to move it down to a Schedule 3. But for right now, it's still a Schedule 1 drug. Right? Well, why? Who has marijuana killed? Right? But how many people have died from fentanyl overdoses? Right? How many people have died from, they take too much of their Percocet and it knocks them out, right? Like, right? And then there's a few others down there. Okay. 1 through 5. So like, how did we even get here? Okay. So before we get there, let's talk a little bit about a concept called critical race theory, or CRT. Okay. There's a reason why we're going to talk about this. It connects to all of this. All right. So critical race theory does not posit that white people are bad, unlike your uncle, or like your uncle on Facebook likely believes. Thankfully, when I did this a few years ago, critical race theory was kind of like in the news a lot, and now it's kind of not as much because Fox News has stopped screaming about it. But the theory was the people who heard about critical race theory, and it's being taught in schools. It is graduate level courses, but basically it posits that while individual people may not be overtly racist, the laws and the systems that they create disproportionately impact a particular set of people, usually minorities or those in a lower selected class. Okay. So again, CRT, critical race theory, is not that white people are bad. That's how it got spun. Thanks, Fox News. It posits that if you walk up to a person and say, "Hey, are you racist?" Unless they have a white hood on or they say, "Hey, I'm a racist," most people will go, "No, I'm not racist. I have a black friend," right? But most people are going to say, "I'm not racist." Okay. However, they may put mechanisms in place that disproportionately impact a particular set of people unintentionally. Okay. So, let's talk about this map that I have. And it's not being taught, by the way, it's not being taught in middle and high school like many Karens who show up to school board meetings believe it to be. It's like, oh, they're teaching it. And my granny was asking me about, are they teaching that critical race theory to Cora? No, Cora is like now learning how to spell effectively. You think she's going to be able to understand the dynamics of racial profiling and having unintentional racial consequences? So let's talk about this map. Let's talk about redlining. Okay. So following the Great Depression, houses were being foreclosed on at a record rate. FDR, who was the president at the time, proposed the New Deal, which provided government-insured mortgages for people who did not have the means, right? So in any economy, the number one indicator of how healthy an economy is how many people are buying homes, right? When you have home buying, there's so many other things that are going on. You're employing electricians, you're employing plumbers, you're employing people to build the house. There's all, when new houses are being built and people are buying houses, that's a good sign that your economy is going really well. Well, after the Great Depression, that all tanked. Okay. So the New Deal provided government insured mortgages for people who did not have the means, or people who were getting, stuff foreclosed on. Basically, the New Deal said, hey, to the banks, hey, if you will give them a loan, we'll back it and you'll be okay. So as the program evolved, the government appraisers would go around to these areas and they would rank them based on least risky, which would be the A, to the most risky, which would be a D. So A, B, C, D. Okay. Now, we don't have, we're not fully into integration at this time. Slavery has ended, obviously. Juneteenth is, 50 years past, 60 years past. We're in the 1930s, 20s and 30s at this time. But America is still kind of not really great with the whole segregation thing. But we can't discriminate, right? So they're still, even though, they're not fully segregated, we still don't want to discriminate, right? So we can't say black people can't have this. However, what we can do is we can go in and mark the areas that are the most risky to the least risky. And wouldn't you know it, those marked the most risky just happen to be the neighborhoods where persons of color resided. Isn't that interesting? And so if a person of color wanted to go to one of these areas and say, hey, I'd like to purchase a home in this particular place, they would get denied their loan. Banks were not going to do it because of it being in that area. Okay. And that effectively kept persons of color from securing loans to buy a home. Now, FDR didn't intend for that to happen. It wasn't written, we're not going to do this to black people. But the government appraisers were going in, and whether they were racist or not, they probably were. It just so happened that the places where persons of color resided the most were ranked the most risky, and therefore were less likely to get a loan to buy a home. Now, surely that's a thing of the past, right? There's no way, we're way past that. We're almost 100 years past that, right? Well, about that. So, put that to the test. There was a little experiment about home appraisals, right? The first time that a appraisal, right, they put a home that had traditional African-American or persons of color symbolisms. So like African masks and tribal things and, pictures of the family, African-American family, etc. So things that would stereotypically indicate an African-American or a person of color lives in this house. And they appraised it $330,000. Okay. And they got a second appraisal where they removed all of that stuff and they put in a stereotypical Caucasian family's home. And wouldn't you know it, it got appraised for much more. Interesting, right? It's interesting. And so, why does that matter? Well, if a person of color, let's say they bought the house for $200,000, let's just say, and their appraisal was $330,000, that's $130,000. If it's a stereotypical white family, why is it $135,000 more? It's the same house, right? So we have to be okay. This was all right. Fine. I cherry picked. You may say I cherry picked this one particular thing, and that doesn't look at this, right? Why do these things matter? A home that is appraised for $465,000, you're going to pay higher taxes on it into the local community. Those local tax dollars go to the schools and other stuff mainly the schools, but other stuff's in there too. Police, fire, rescue, EMS, blah, 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 to gentrify, all of these things are connected. So if it's a higher rate that's going to be paid at a higher tax, those schools are going to have better resources and on and on and on, right? These things are all connected. So look at this gap between communities of color and white neighborhoods. It's a huge gap, all because of the residents in the area, right? Again, you think we could be way past that, but America has the hardest time wrestling with racism and classism. We do this too for poor people. Right? There's a different, if it's a rich neighborhood versus a poor neighborhood, we look at, I say we, not us in here, but society as a whole, if you're poor, there's some sort of failing on but that's not true. It's not true. It's not because of decisions that you may or may not have made. It could be that the system is working against you, and it's hard to get out of that. When we think about, and I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, talking about equity, right? Again, going back to that thing about the pharmacy, for many of you, if you were sick, your parents pulled you out of school, took you right to the doctor. The pharmacy was either in the doctor's office or like the Kroger right down the street. You just drove there, got your prescription, and you probably go back to school. But for other people, communities of color, communities of poorer communities, that's not an option. It's just not, right? You look at people that are on, so for instance, those are that are on the Medicaid line, right? There are people that have prescriptions that Medicaid fully covers. If they go on commercial insurance, now they're responsible for it. I think of a patient who she gets Social Security and her Social Security went up by like $30, but that Social Security put her over the limit for Medicaid by like $5 and they pulled her prescription. They pulled her insurance. What? She's barely over the line. And like, so it's just, all of these things are connected. This is just kind of being able to think about it, kind of a big picture. Is it not just with racism, but also classism? Okay. We have used opiates for a long time, right? This was written by Benjamin Franklin. I have been obliged to recourse to opium, which indeed has afforded me some ease from time to time, but then it has taken away my appetite, so impeded my digestion, which is called opiate-induced constipation, that I have become totally emaciated, so little remains of me a skeleton covered with skin. We have used opiates for a long time, even from the 1700s, and it was sent over here from China. We get it imported. We also, parents for colicky or teething children would use opium on the gums to help them ease some of that pain, right? In fact, there was a medicine called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and it was opium to help kids that were teething. Well, yeah, right? Problem is that like if you gave them a little bit too much, they'd go into cardiac or they'd go into their lungs would quit working, and they would die. So that was, kind of be off the market, but we used opiates. Opium was out there. It was promoted, right? But then immigrants from China came along. And we talk about Western expansion. We're in the 1800s, 1830s, 40s. And as we're going out into the Western expansion, there's a big gold rush out there in San Francisco, which, by the way, is why the San Francisco 49ers are called the San Francisco 49ers, because of 1849 gold, blah, blah, blah. You get it. And so there are these titans of industry that are trying to build railroads. They're trying to get gold going. And they figured, hey, there's people from China that want to come and do it. So they'd put them on a boat, they'd bring them over here, and they would put them to work, right? Because they would work cheaper, and they didn't really complain about it because they're over here in America. Well, as the Chinese came over here, they then also brought their culture, which included the use of opium and the use of opiates. Well, there were people who didn't really like that all of these Chinese people were coming over here. And so smoking opium in the city limits is banned and confined to the neighboring Chinatowns and the opium dens. Okay, you can do it, but just go away and go do it somewhere else, right? President Chester A. Arthur then passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which says no more Chinese immigrants. You can't bring them over here. And they're protected. The ones that are here are protected, but you can't bring any more, right? So you just leave them out. We don't want them. Okay. U.S. Congress then imposes a tax on opium and morphine. Okay. So if we can't get rid of it, we're just going to, like, if you're going to keep shipping it over here, we're going to tax it very heavily to try to get it out, get you. So you Chinese immigrants, if you're wanting to get your stuff over here, you're going to have to figure out how to afford it, because we're going to tax it very, very heavily. In the 1890s, tabloids owned by William Hearst, which if you watch WLWT, the bloodline of the Hearst organization that owns WLWT and other organizations, publishes stories of white women being seduced by Chinese men into their opium dens to invoke fear of a yellow peril. They are the enemy. They are the reason that we are struggling with this opiate crisis that we're in. Mr. Bo is very handsome, but he does this thing where he just kind of paces and then he just like lays down. And I just took him outside. I don't really know what he wants other than for me to go lay on the couch and stop lecturing. And then in 1895, lo and behold, the Bayer Corporation, yes, that Bayer company that makes headache medicine, is synthesized and created. And it is, you could get it from a doctor, right? So now it's being prescribed. So now it's totally fine because we're making money off of it, Bayer company, where it's totally good, right? And this was a little vial of heroin. You can get it from a doctor. Right. So we move into the 1900s. You get it from a doctor. Now people are kind of getting hooked. So small samples of heroin are given through to curb morphine addiction. It was used as a treatment. Then in 1905, U.S. Congress just bans opium. And then in 1909 is the prohibition of opium and then the rise of cocaine abuse. Keep in mind, as one thing goes down, something else may take its place and oftentimes does. In this case, it was cocaine. So now let's go to the Deep South, right? We've talked about the West, how, Chinese immigration and people that didn't like the immigrants being over here and taking all of the jobs, people would get pissed. And so now we can't like be racist towards them. I guess we kind of could, but they're already here and they're working. So how about we try to just kind of discriminate against them in some ways? So we've been over there, seen how that works. Now let's go to the Deep South. We're talking Georgia. Georgia, South Carolina, that area. The rise of cocaine. Now I'm using the terminology of the time. This is out of respect to the terminology at the time. Okay. Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace. So we're out of slavery. So slavery's done in theory. Slavery's done. Juneteenth has happened. Now we're in the 1900s, 1910s. Cocaine is out there now. Okay. And there is this fear that blacks, Negroes, are going to be using cocaine and they will become superhuman, and that will lead to them attacking the children, police, society, and everything that we know as society will be destroyed because these Negro cocaine fiends are going to destroy everything. This was written by a doctor in the New York Times. This is in the New York Times archive, by the way. And so it's this new menace that we have to watch out for because they're going to destroy everything in the South. Right. So then we go into the alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, which worked out fantastically, didn't it, kids? Well, here's the interesting thing about alcohol prohibition. It was spearheaded by a group of Protestant fanaticals who believed that the reason that society was breaking down at the time, which keep in mind, we're going through we're in the wake of World War I. We are trying to the Great Depression is about to happen. So society, things are kind of falling apart. And the idea is that, the reason that society is falling apart is because of alcohol. Alcohol is the problem. So in order for us to combat this, we need to ban alcohol. Just get rid of it. Right now, a lot of this prohibition stuff was actually happening in Newport, up here in Northern Kentucky. And so here's the thing, though. The alcohol prohibition really only affected people of a lower class. That's who we were worried about. And African Americans. The high society, they kept using alcohol. They never stopped. And they had what were called speakeasies. And if you're not familiar with why they were called a speakeasy, it would be in the back corner or in the back room of an establishment, and you would knock on the door and you would have to speak real easy to get in. And then once you got in, you had to be real quiet because we didn't want anybody to know that we're back here, right? And so even in some places, if the cops were called, sometimes they were in on it. Because as you can see here in 1925, the Cotton Club, right? Now look who's waiting the door. It's African Americans. Isn't that interesting? But you know, they would have flapper parties, which these lovely young ladies are flappers. But alcohol was still out there. It was just directed at a particular class of people. We wrote laws to impact certain classes of people. And it also funded some of the stuff with the mob. It helped them, which, by the way, was in Newport. And so society was still, you know, we went back on that and went back on alcohol prohibition. But then that turned into reefer madness and marijuana. So following the Mexican Revolution of 1910, immigrants started to flood into the United States. Now, of course, we're talking about Texas, New Mexico, Arizona to a certain degree, although I think they were states at that time. I don't know my state history, but I know Texas was a state. So they're flooding into Texas. And again, as it was with the Chinese immigrants, they bring their culture, right? And so people are, again, upset that here are these Mexicans that are flooding the United States. They're taking the low-paying jobs that, quite frankly, Americans didn't, or you know, people didn't really want to do. But they're taking those jobs for cheap because they're trying to get out. They're just trying to make a living. And again, they bring that. Well, there's people that are upset that that's happening, right? And so the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is created in the 1930s, and then hysteria surrounding marijuana was rising. 29 states by that time, and again, in just 20 years, 29 states had banned marijuana from use, and it was, you know, weird orgies, wild parties, misery, people smoking weed. It's going to come for your kids. There was a movie called Reefer Madness. I think it's out there. I mean, you can watch it, I think, on YouTube. That it's going to lead you, the desire to use marijuana is going to lead you to kill your mother, right? And that's what it's purported. It was just this hysteria surrounding this drug. And a lot of it, the reason that it was out there is because of the fear that Mexican immigrants were going to take over society. They're going to take over and they're going to bring in all this marijuana and we're going to be using drugs all the time. And so we created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and we labeled it as a narcotic. So now of course there's treatment stuff out there and we're talking, you know, whatever, but let's go a little bit further ahead. Let's talk about Richard Nixon. The Nixon campaign in 1968 in the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You know what I'm saying? We knew that we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war, because that would be the First Amendment thing, or blacks, which would be a discriminatory and a civil rights violation. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both of those, we could disrupt the communities. This was John Ehrlichman, who was the assistant to the president of domestic affairs in the Nixon White House. This actually happened. This was real, and it shows. So Nixon, for those of you that don't remember your full American history, kind of a shady dude. And he was going through a difficult time with trying to figure out how to get reelected. And so you have two parts of trying to manage this curve. You have the demand and you have the supply, right? So if you want to reduce the supply, you go after the drug dealers. If you want to reduce the demand, then you would go after the people who are using the drug. So if you give them treatment, the demand is going to go down. They get healthy. Right. So as you can see here, Nixon kind of starts his shift. At first, he's all about demand reduction. We're going to put money into treatment. We're going to blah, 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 blah. But then he starts to subtly shift. You can see that, yes, they're still spending a significant amount of money on demand reduction, but it flattens. You can see it's going up, but then it drops, right? And the supply reduction starts to grow gradually. Okay. Which then leads us into, so here we're looking at like Jimmy Carter, right? And then here would be Ronald Reagan. We're going to talk about Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan was the governor of California in 1967. At that time, it was legal to openly carry guns in California. Well, at least until these members of the Black Panther Party showed up and demand equal treatment and fair treatment as they brought in firearms. Suddenly, Governor Reagan and the NRA supported regulations of guns. Imagine that. And the leader of the Black Panther Party even said, if black people bought all kinds of guns and showed up to government sites, we would have gun regulation by the end of the day. And that's true, right? The Black Panther Party disbanded in 1977. Shortly after that, an internal coup here in Cincinnati formed the new perspective of the NRA. So the NRA, as we know it today, is all about Second Amendment rights, which is okay, fine. But, and everybody gets a gun. But I shouldn't be flippant. They're about responsible gun ownership. Okay, I said all that. But at one time, they were about regulating who can own a gun. So they shifted that policy, right? So then in 1980, Ronald Reagan became the Republican candidate for president, and he was endorsed by the NRA. Okay. So Ronald and Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign, which completely ended all drug addiction for the rest of time. The Just Say No campaign has lost. Oh, it's funny. A little thing here. The crack cocaine usage in African Americans is growing, which then prompts the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. You know, just coincidentally. And that is still on the books today. At that time in New York City, crack cocaine use was on the rise. Now, keep in mind, in the 70s, cocaine was everywhere. Powder cocaine was everywhere. Okay. And, you would go to Club 54, or I'm sorry, Studio 54 in New York City. You would get a business card, and on the back of it would be a little bump of cocaine. The white person's drug, the champagne of drugs. It'd be used by all kinds of affluent white people. But then in the early 1980s, especially in New York City, but in other inner cities, crack use amongst African Americans is growing. And that prompted to revamp drug laws that are, again, still on the books today. And they are heavily, heavily, heavily geared in one particular direction. There's also a significant, remember this, right? So going from there, look, the supply, we are going during this time, there is a heavy, even in the Clinton years. From 80 to 92 was all Republican, right? So 80 to 88 was Reagan. 88 to 92 was Daddy Bush, and then 92 to 2000 was Clinton. And you can see that it stayed that way, right? We've got all of this increase in spending on trying to reduce the supply and not a lot on trying to reduce the demand. We're all about criminalization. We're all about, we're going to lock these people up. We're going to look at drugs being a moral issue. We've got to be hard on crime. We've got to be hard on drugs. We've got to push these people into prison, and then they will learn their lesson, right? We're going to whip people up into a frenzy and fear, right? It also introduced things called mandatory minimums. These are federal sentencing laws that were recently updated in 2015. I think actually the Trump administration updated it to maybe 15 to 1. I think it had a shift as well. But these two things here, this is powder cocaine. This is crack cocaine, right? They're looked at in the exact same light. Exact same light. If you Emma N should know this. Do you know the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine? Any of you? I'll wait as you say it out loud, or Google it very quickly, or get on ChatGPT. Baking soda, water, heat. That's it. That is the only difference. You put baking soda, water, and heat to powder cocaine, you get crack cocaine. That's it. That's the only difference. And yet they're looked at as being equivalent, right? All of this here is the same as this here. That just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense. However, who's going to be caught with this amount of powder cocaine? Drug dealers, probably, right? People sell, which makes sense. Who's going to be caught with this little amount of crack cocaine? A lot of people, usually poor people, usually, I don't know, African Americans. Isn't that interesting? Right? Because that's who was utilizing it most frequently. So then that brings up the question, are our drug laws inherently racist? No, not necessarily. However, the application of those laws may certainly be. When we look at this this report here, blacks, African Americans, are 3.73 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. Even look here in Kentucky. African Americans are arrested at 6 times the rate, even though if you look at our demographics, the state of Kentucky is 87.5% white. So why? Look at it national and worldwide. The United States has 4.25% of the world's population. We also have 23.3% of the world's prison population. Just think about it. And even look at this here. We're using at the same rate. Whites and blacks use at the same rate, but yet the arrests are significantly geared towards African Americans. So why is there such a disparity? If the laws aren't in theory intended to have a racial bias, and since Caucasian and African Americans use drugs at relatively the same rate, why is there such a difference? What influence does the, again, talking about capitalism, private prison system play in all of this? What value is there on rehabilitation versus incarceration? And how, if at all, does this influence treatment recommendations that you make? Why is this important? When I was doing intensive outpatient programming, or IOP, we're going to talk about that when we talk about treatment down the road. But IOP is 3 days a week, 3 hours a day ish. You have to do 9 hours a week of treatment in a group. And so I would do 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. And we, at the time, I was working with Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties. So people who would get arrested for a drug offense, usually a Class D felony, the standard is nine months of incarceration. Well, what would happen is people could agree to do what's called SAP, or a substance abuse program, where they would come and see me for IOP, and they would get, they could get their time reduced and be out and be allowed out. It's interesting that in my time doing that, over a year and some change, I had a ton of patients, and I only had maybe like 2 African Americans. Even though I know that they were getting arrested for possession, they weren't necessarily given the option to come to IOP, and I wonder why that is. You know what I mean? And that does have an influence. We go, how do we view people struggling with addiction if they're a person of color versus Caucasian? And again, the data backs it up. I mean, in the state of Kentucky, 6 times more likely to be arrested. Something to think about. Since we're on the topic of laws, let's talk about something that's available here in the state of Kentucky and in Ohio. That, by the way, that's the end of the lecture. This is just more of an aside. You're not going to be tested on this. I'm just giving this to you for information. So, this young man here, his name is Casey Wethington. And Casey passed away from a heroin overdose. However, his mother, Michelle, who is an absolutely amazing woman, got really frustrated that you can't mandate someone to go to treatment. So the way treatment works now is, the way treatment works is you can no longer force someone to go to treatment. And so, so for instance, a person can decide that they want to go to treatment, or they can agree, they can tell a family member, hey, I want to go get treatment. And then the family member can drive them to the treatment center, and then they can sit in the lobby for 30 minutes and then get up and leave. And that's perfectly fine. Or they can engage in treatment for like a day and then just decide they want to leave. And there's nothing that we can do as treatment professionals to keep them there. We can't keep them there. Also, if I'm working with someone, and this is something to think about. If I am working with someone and they come to my office and they are drunk, I cannot take their keys. That's forced imprisonment. I can't take it. I can't do that. I have to, even though I know, and I can't call the cops. I have to give them their keys and they leave. I know it's messed up, but that's how the law is written. Anyway, so Casey would be in and out of treatment. He would stay for a few weeks, and then or day or hours, and then he would leave. And he would go find, whatever. Well, so did I say Michelle? Her name's Charlotte. I don't know where I came up with Michelle. Charlotte Wethington. That's his mom. Started a campaign called Casey's Law. And so basically what Casey's Law does is, if you have someone, and it doesn't even have to be a family member, it can be a friend that you're concerned about. If they are struggling with an addiction and they are refusing to get treatment, and you feel like they are a danger to themselves or others because of their substance use, you can go to your county court clerk's office and you can petition to have them evaluated for treatment. Okay. It requires the following. It doesn't require, you're not out anything if you go and do it. Like, it doesn't require, all you just do is show up. But for the Casey's Law process to be completed, it requires 2 assessments. One of them has to be from a medical doctor. The second one has to come from either another medical doctor or from someone like me that's a treatment professional, a therapist or a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor. As the petitioner, and again, this could be a parent. You could say, hey, my parent is struggling. My husband is struggling. I think my kid is struggling. A friend, an uncle, a cousin, whatever. And I think they need treatment. You state on there, why do you think that? Why are they a threat to themselves? And what do you want for treatment? What do you think would be best for treatment? And so then they go to the assessments. They do the assessment, and then you go to court, and usually based on what the treatment professionals say, the judge will sign off on it, and then they will have to go to treatment. Or if they don't go, they get arrested and held for however long the treatment was going to be, or until they decide to go. And then they can leave. They're allowed to leave, but then they would be in violation of a court order, and there'd be a bench warrant put on their arrest, on their record. And if they get picked up for a, parking violation, then they get taken in because there's a bench warrant out for their arrest. So it's not perfect, but it's at least something that parents and people can have to try to get their loved one into treatment. If you're interested to know more about this, shoot me an email, reach out to me. We can talk about it. But I wanted to give this to you so that you know what's available. There's one for mental health called Tim's Law that's out there too. Works the exact same way. But we're talking about substance use, so that's what this is. That's all I got this week. I hope this was interesting and entertaining and all the things. If you got questions, reach out to me. I hope things are going well this semester, and we will pick back up next week. As always, Canada Gooses are definitive proof that evil exists. Live mahalo. I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.